Invasive rats off the Aleutian Islands. That was the topic up for discussion at the BP Energy Building in Anchorage. The event was hosted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
They called it reckless, cruel, and doomed to backfire. Australia's plan to wipe out every rat and rabbit on a windswept speck of land in the Southern Ocean. Critics mocked it as an overflow. Yet what unfolded next didn't just silence the noise. It stunned the very scientists who warned against it. In this video, we pull apart the mission that rewrote an entire ecosystem. We'll track the backlash, the risky bait drops, and the eerie quiet that followed. And then, we'll reveal the jaw-dropping comeback no one dared predict, one that could change conservation forever. Island on the Edge. Far south of mainland Australia, a lonely speck of green and rock sits battered by wind and waves. It's the kind of place most people would never think twice about, a remote island tucked within the icy belt of the Southern Ocean. But for decades, this island was living through a quiet apocalypse. Once, it was a sanctuary for millions of seabirds, blanketed in thick vegetation and echoing with calls that could be heard from miles offshore. Yet by the late 20th century, it had become something else entirely, a graveyard of bare earth and broken nests. The culprits? Not storms, not climate change, but rats and rabbits, both introduced by humans long ago. The story began more than a century earlier, when sealing and whaling ships stopped at the island to restock supplies. Stowaway rats leapt ashore from cargo and wrecks, scavenging for eggs and chicks in a paradise with no natural predators. Later, rabbits were deliberately released by settlers looking to create a food source, never realizing they had just unleashed an ecological disaster. Together, these two species, small, persistent, and insatiable, slowly gnawed their way through one of Australia's most fragile ecosystems. By the 1980s, the indicators of the collapse were simply too big to ignore. The island's characteristic vegetation, massive cushion-forming herbs that used to cover the slopes, was simply vanishing. Their roots were the anchor of the soil for centuries, together with the island's extreme weather conditions, winds, and rain. With every hole dug and every plant stem eaten, earthlings were left without their anchors. The mountains started to slip, and peat flowed into the ocean, and landslides made indentations in the cliffs. The returning botanists every season reported ghost zones, stretches of land where only dead stalks and rabbit holes were left. The seabirds had no better fate. The rats infiltrated their nests and burrows during the night, and slaying the chicks and empuers, and taking the eggs with brutal efficiency. Petrels, prions, and shearwaters, birds that had been there for thousands of years, could barely even keep their colonies, and thus they shrank to a size that was even a minute fraction of the previous one. The rangers remembered traversing what seemed like a war field. Empty burrows, shattered eggshells, and silence, where once the air had been filled with noise. In some parts, entire species disappeared from the breeding records. The cycle of life on the island was being drilled down from below. Scientists attempted to use small-scale measures as a way to fight rats. They applied poison bait, trapping, and fencing only in small areas of the island. But even then, the size of the island and its rough terrain made it impossible to get rid of the rats completely. For each rat that was caught, it looked like 10 more were coming to take its place. With one rabbit gone, another hole would be dug in the following season. Faced with a living system unraveling in slow motion, managers proposed a fix so controversial it set off a firestorm. The plan nobody wanted. When the proposal was first made public, it sounded more like a desperate fantasy than a realistic conservation effort. The Australian government announced that it would attempt what no nation had ever done on such a scale, to completely eradicate every rat and rabbit from the island. The plan was ambitious, expensive, and morally divisive. Even among scientists, opinions split sharply. Some hailed it as the only way to save a dying ecosystem. Others warned it was reckless, an overreach that could end in ecological chaos. From the very start, the logistics alone bordered on the impossible. The island was vast, rugged, and unpredictable, whipped by gale-force winds for most of the year. To reach every corner would mean weeks of helicopter flights, bait drops timed between storms, and field teams trekking through bogs and cliffs. Each rabbit and rat had to be targeted without harming the very species the operation was meant to protect. A single misstep could poison seabirds, insects, or even fragile soil systems that took centuries to form. The blueprint was drawn in phases. First, there would be intensive mapping of every rabbit warren and rat colony, using GPS tracking and thermal imaging to understand how deep the infestation ran. Then, specialized bait laced with rodenticide would be dropped from helicopters in precisely measured grids, ensuring no patch of ground went untreated. Ground teams with detector dogs would sweep through afterward, checking for survivors. Finally, an independent verification phase would confirm zero detections across multiple seasons, a process that could take years. The plan was seen by conservation officials as a lifeline. Critics, on the other hand, considered it a nightmare that was slowly coming into being. Disposals of welfare organizations and their advocates protested, claiming that poisoning any animal, regardless of its invasiveness, is cruelty. Environmentalists in the government's trap called it hypocrisy, annihilating fauna while professing to conserve nature. Besides, it was the extinction of the island's minor species that would perhaps cause unpredictable wave effects, leading to further imbalance of the already fragile ecosystem. Who are we, one opponent questioned, to make a decision on who lives and dies on our already ruined island? There was a strong backlash from the public. At the same time, especially by the commentators called the bait drop of doom, some predicted copiously that the operation would even fail. The way its result would be nothing less than the island being full of dead animals and toxins. Debaters on social media had a real emotional clash. What is the reason for justifying the slaying of so many, even if it is for a good cause? Could it be that nature can be fixed by using force? The derision and scorn experienced were loud, global, and very unrelenting. Nevertheless, the project headquarters were quite different in their mood. The biologist, as well as the field officers, conducted the process of working through each day and night to planning sessions, going through the data of several decades. In fact, they were not merely fighting the invasion. Rather, they were racing against time. Monitoring reports were indicating that the whole species of seabirds were about to become extinct in the area. The soil was eroded at a faster rate than the models could predict, and the native plants were dying out even more quickly than the models could tell. They presented the case that to do nothing was no longer an ethical option, and that action, no matter how controversial, was the only way left. Approval came with caveats and a countdown, and once the first rotor turned, there was no gentle way to pause the sky. Operation Zero Survivors. The day the operation began, the island fell eerily silent. For months, its winds had carried only the cries of seabirds and the constant hum of human machinery preparing for war, an ecological war unlike any before it. Then, with the roar of helicopter blades echoing through the mist, the mission called Operation Zero Survivors officially began. To the teams on the ground, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. There would be no second chance. The island's terrain was merciless. Sheer cliffs rose from the sea, and inland plateaus turned to deep bogs that swallowed boots and equipment alike. Helicopter crews had one of the most delicate jobs in conservation history: drop poisoned bait across every inch of the island, without leaving gaps or overlaps. Each flight path was plotted with military precision using GPS grids. Every pellet had to count. If even a handful of rats or rabbits survived, the population could explode again within a single breeding season, undoing years of effort and millions in funding. As the first baits rained down, the air smelled faintly metallic, a strange mix of grain dust and chemicals. Rangers stationed at ground level monitored wind speed and direction, relaying updates to pilots through crackling radios. When gusts threatened to blow the bait off course, drops were paused. The team worked within seconds of precision, timing each release around weather windows that often lasted only hours. Many missions were aborted mid-flight, forcing pilots to circle back to base, refuel, and wait out storms that rolled in from the Antarctic. Besides, the field crews were up and down the tough parts of the island on foot. They were to get to the narrow places where helicopters could not land safely, like passing through gulches, at the foot of cliffs, and in tussock fields. With the help of hand-baiters and motion-triggered cameras, the gaps were covered one grid square at a time. Every team member took with him GPS units, emergency beacons, and survival kits. The weather could change in a few minutes, from sunny to blizzard, and workers were more than once trapped by sleet or fog so thick that they could not see 5 meters ahead. During the night, the camp was filled with tiredness and excitement. The food supply was limited, and the communication with the outside world was confined to a few satellite messages. Yet, the spirits were high. Each flight, each drop confirmed was a step closer to the restoration of the island's delicate ecosystem. The intensity of the mission was, however, a burden to the pilots. They had to fly helicopters for hundreds of hours in very severe conditions. The ground teams were constantly battling with hypothermia, frostbite, and fatigue. The island was testing not only their skills, but also their patience and the support of the project's purpose. The subsequent stage followed closely, getting rid of the remaining ones. After baiting, the island underwent a long period of silent watching. Detector dogs with their trainers were used, and they were specially trained to smell rats and rabbits. They walked around the island in every area and smelled the ground for any life. Cameras were working 24 hours a day. The bait stations were checked often, and chew blocks, tiny pieces of flavored wax that record tooth marks, were scattered across the land. Every data was of great importance. When the last hopper shut and the blades went silent, something stranger than victory settled over the island. The eerie quiet. When the last helicopter left the island, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like abandonment. The roar of engines faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie stillness that blanketed every ridge and valley. For the first time in centuries, the island was completely devoid of its uninvited residents. No rustle in the grass, no scratching beneath the soil, just the wind, the waves, and the slow hum of life, trying to remember what it used to sound like. At first, the silence was unsettling. Rangers who had spent years fighting an endless war against rats and rabbits found themselves surrounded by emptiness. The island's soundscape had always included the background noise of digging, squeaking, and nocturnal chaos. Now it was gone. Some described it as peaceful. Others said it felt ghostly, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Even the seabirds seemed hesitant at first, circling the cliffs as though testing whether it was truly safe to return. Relief and anxiety mixed together right after the incident. The scientists were aware that the forthcoming months would be critical in determining the success of the operation or the presence of a concealed survivor waiting to reinitiate the invasion. The monitoring was going on intensively from the moment the last bait was set. Hundreds of camera traps were installed on the island that took pictures of every movement. Detector dogs were put back into action to search for scent trails, and at the same time, motion sensors and chew blocks were deployed in the grass like silent sentinels. Therefore, every single lot was data. The first feedback arrived silent, too silent. There were no tracks, no feces, no marking of nests. On paper, that was something good. However, the group did not get rid of the persistent fear. Had they done the impossible, or were they just missing what was left behind in the margins? The verification phase was meticulous in its manner. Each section had to be examined and re-examined, sometimes in conditions like icy rain or thick fog. At times, helicopters would fly in to deliver supplies to the camps, and their presence served as a reminder that even though the success was there, the isolation was still total. Nevertheless, the victory had a moral aspect that not even the data could diminish. The undertaking had resulted in the death of some animals, not targeted species, but those that were caught in the crossfire of a war that, though necessary, was waged. A few birds that fed on dead animals and small invertebrates had been affected by the poison, and although the number of deaths was insignificant when compared to the size of the improvement, they still left a scar on the people who saw them. The scientists took note of every casualty, not to defend the damage done, but to teach from it. Each report turned into part of an uneasy but essential record, proof that even the best of intentions require consequences. From week to week, the island slowly but surely started to show its little changes. With no more livestock feeding, the ground started to regenerate. Places where peat lay softened, mosses came back, and little green plants went up through soil that was burnt black. The first green tint came back to the once and for a long time barren mountainsides. The water in the streams was clear again, no more muddy sediment causing the choking. It was like a long, sleepy island was waking up for the researchers who were there to observe. However, the nature of recovery is such that it never happens immediately. The silence of nature, which was serene now, became a trial of patience. Scientists were well aware that it could take tropical years for the seabird numbers to go up, for the plants to be totally settled, and for the whole ecosystem to be balanced. The island was going through a fragile new life, one that might altogether fall down with the mere presence of a pest. Each time a ranger saw some movement far away, it was like a gunshot. Everyone would stop, and the ranger would look for traces of fur or droppings. Each false alarm was a reminder of how fragile victory could be. Then, almost overnight, the island seemed to exhale, and nature hit a button no one had seen before. Fast forward. Nature hits. Fast forward. It began almost imperceptibly, tiny green flecks sprouting through blackened peat, a feathered shape landing where no bird had dared in decades. Then, as if someone had lifted a curse, the island erupted into motion. Within months of the last rat and rabbit's disappearance, the transformation became undeniable. Satellite images that once showed bare, eroded slopes now glowed with patches of green. Scientists who had expected a slow, cautious recovery instead found themselves witnessing what one ecologist called ecological acceleration, nature operating in fast forward. The first comeback was botanical. Giant herbs and flowering plants that had been considered functionally extinct on the island began to reappear in places no one thought possible. Seeds, long buried under soil compacted by rabbit burrows, began to germinate. Cushion plants spread across ridges once scraped to rock. Within a single season, entire hillsides that had been brown and lifeless turned lush with soft greens and yellows. Botanists documented a regeneration rate 10 times faster than predicted, forcing them to rewrite recovery models. The island, freed from the constant gnawing of herbivores, was healing itself with astonishing speed. That recovery had a domino effect. As vegetation took hold, the soil began to stabilize. The endless erosion that once bled into the sea slowed dramatically. Root networks bound the land, protecting it from the island's punishing winds. Peatlands, long exposed and drying out, started to retain moisture again. Springs and streams ran clearer, and new wetlands formed where none had existed for decades. The scent of fresh vegetation replaced the sour smell of decay. For scientists used to measuring change in centuries, it felt like watching time itself collapse into weeks. Then the birds arrived. They were the island's first architects, thus governing its ecosystem slowly but steadily through their burrowing, fertilizing, and nesting habits over thousands of years. Their return was spectacular. The seabird colonies that once lost their lives to rat invasions and therefore had their eggs and chicks eaten started to reclaim the hollows they had been born into centuries ago. The very next breeding season after the extermination of the rodents saw the researchers recording nest activity in the places that had been quiet for ages. By the second season, the number of newly born chicks was already in the thousands. The petrels, prions, and shearwaters were once again in the air, with their cries reverberating through the cliffs like a long-forgotten memory brought back to life. It changed the whole situation. The guano they left enriched the soil, thus taking the growth of plants to the next level. Then the insects moved in, not just surviving, but actually thriving due to the vegetation and organic matter. Beetles, worms, and native flies came back in large numbers, thus restoring the food web from the bottom up. Nutrient cycling, which had been broken, started to hum again with every layer of life feeding the next in a cascade of recovery. Even the sea that surrounded the island changed. With the seabirds nesting again, more nutrients got washed back into the sea, thus enriching the near-shore ecosystems and increasing the marine productivity. The island was not only recovering, it was also exuberating life into the surroundings. For the scientists who were observing the transformation, it was practically an overload of sensations. One of the researchers recounted how a ridge that had been completely lifeless just 3 years back had now become a place with waist-high plants all around and even the sound of nesting birds. "It's like the island got back to its original self," the researcher remarked. When the stress was lifted, it just burst back into life. The emotional effect was very strong. A lot of people who had suffered through the years of criticism and doubts now got to see the proof that radical conservation could work, maybe even more effectively than anybody had ever thought possible. However, there was also the aspect of caution among the wonder. Fast transformation, no matter how good, always comes along with new issues. A few plant varieties grew so fast that they started to take over the slower ones. Some insect populations increased drastically, resulting in short-term imbalances before the predators caught up with them. Scientists became aware that even in the restoration of ecosystems, there is turbulence. They don't just go back to their old state, they adapt to the new and different one. Nevertheless, the overall force was hard to ignore. Equilibrium was being restored. But recovery isn't a documentary montage. Every action stirs ripples, and some ripples hit harder than expected. The surprises we didn't predict. At first, the scientists thought the island's recovery was perfect, proof that nature, once freed from its tormentors, could restore itself with precision and grace. But the reality, as always, was more complicated. Within a few years of the eradication, the ecosystem began to reveal its unpredictable side. What looked like paradise reborn was also a living experiment, and experiments rarely unfold without surprises. The first shock came in the form of abundance. Some plant species, freed from centuries of grazing pressure, didn't just grow, they exploded. Certain fast-growing herbs and grasses expanded so rapidly that they started blanketing entire hillsides, choking out slower native plants that had only just begun to return. Botanists noticed a sudden dominance of a few aggressive species that altered the island's appearance in just one season. In some places, fields that were supposed to be diverse mosaics turned into monocultures. It was nature overcorrecting itself, and while it was still healthier than before, it forced scientists to rethink what balance really meant. Then came the scavengers. The mass eradication had left behind thousands of rabbit and rat carcasses, and for a short but critical period, those remains became a feast for opportunistic species. Gulls, skuas, and even insects surged in number, drawn by the sudden glut of food. The effect was temporary but dramatic, waves of scavengers sweeping across the island in feeding frenzies. The carcass pulse, as researchers called it, changed behavior patterns across the food web. Some gull populations lingered longer than expected, reshaping competition among other seabirds. What was meant as an ending had created a brief, chaotic banquet of life and decay. The shape of the island itself was another surprise. The vegetation regrows at an astonishing rate. The ground, first dry and hard, became different. Dense roots collected the water, and this in turn changed the courses of drainage. Thus, the low-lying areas were swampy. These swamps, together with the birds that had been displaced, changed the boundaries of the old colonies. Some of the valleys even experienced small landslides, which were the weight of the regenerating peat. Strangely enough, the same process of erosion had been the cause of such suffering on the island in the past. The island now seemed to draw a new shape for itself through the process of healing. The weather was almost reacting too. A plant cover that had been restored was conducive to more soil moisture, and that was a subtle but important factor in humidity and local microclimates. The field teams were able to point out changes in fog patterns and were consequently aware of the temperature difference between the invading greenery and the barren coastline. The island's recovery was not only a matter of ecological change, but also a matter of change in its atmosphere. Each change, though natural, would also have a cascading effect that would remind the scientists of how closely connected the different aspects of a living system are. Surprises weren't limited to the human aspect of the project as well. The data analysts on the mainland had forecasted that it would take at least 10 years for the seabird population to bounce back to the levels that were observed before the invasion. However, in the 5th year, the nesting densities were so great that the monitoring system could not cope with it. The rangers caught in the middle of the action felt that they could not move through the colonies. Each step they took was a risk of a burrow collapsing. The success was more than what was expected, but a new challenge was in managing it. However, not all the disruptions were mild. The gradual reclamation of the island by the old ecosystem affected some fragile species negatively, particularly invertebrates that had been living through the harsh conditions of the invasion years. It was an ironic dilemma. Conservation of one set of species led to the extinction of another. Ecologists had to admit that restoration is never a return. It is always a recreation. The aspiration was not to rewind the island to a bygone era of its past, but rather to allow it to be in its own state of equilibrium. What happened on this island is now a case file, and its lessons are steering global conservation with uncommon clarity. Blueprint for a planet. By the time the island's ecosystem had stabilized, what began as a controversial experiment had become a scientific milestone. The eradication that once drew mockery and outrage was now being studied in universities, cited in journals, and presented at international conferences. It wasn't just about saving a remote corner of the Southern Ocean anymore. It was about redefining what humanity could do when it took full responsibility for the damage it caused. The story of this island had evolved from scandal to blueprint. Around the world, conservationists began to see the operation as a turning point. For decades, most governments had hesitated to launch full-scale eradications, fearing political backlash, high costs, or failure. But the island's success, measured not in headlines but in data, vegetation cover, and the return of seabirds, proved that it was possible to restore ecosystems even after centuries of degradation. The project's architects, once ridiculed, were now fielding requests for guidance from teams working in places as distant as the Pacific, the Caribbean, and the sub-Antarctic. The methods pioneered here, precise baiting, targeted sweeps, and long-term verification, became the gold standard for invasive species control. The outcome of this mission was not what made it stand out, but rather its philosophy. During the mission, conservation showed that compassion was not about saving all life. It was about preventing all life's suffering. Allowing invasive species to wipe out the native flora and fauna was not an act of mercy. It was simply turning a deaf ear. The eradication team had overturned a misconception that was so deeply ingrained that it was not even questioned, namely, that intervention meant cruelty. Actually, the slaying of nature was doing nothing at all. The whole operation and its success changed the ethics of environmental management. It made the global community face a harsh truth. Sometimes, the only way to save nature is to choose the hard but necessary path. Policymakers did pay attention to this matter. After the project, Australia, together with its partners, set up new frameworks for biosecurity and island restoration. These new policies were heavily focused on prevention rather than cure. Hence, they included stricter quarantine laws, more advanced detection technologies, and constant monitoring to make sure that no invasive species would ever be able to gain a foothold again. The eradication had been a great teacher, and it had taught them that the fixing of a broken ecosystem is infinitely harder than the protecting of an intact one. One scientist summed it all up nicely by saying, "The best restoration is the one you never have to do." The consequences of the whole situation were felt not only in Australia, but also in other countries like New Zealand, the islands located in the Indian Ocean, and even in South America, which started doing similar things as the project. Some of the islands even went as far as using drones instead of helicopters. Others even resorted to using AI to keep track of animal movements. However, the main idea stayed the same: precision, patience, and total commitment. All over the world, where small islands were grappling with the problem of invasive species, the experiences of this remote outpost were a beacon. The island, which had once been ridiculed as a failure that was just waiting to happen, had now turned into an emblem of optimism. If this deep dive changed how you see conservation, like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this. And when you're ready, watch the next video on your screen. Another bold mission that rewrote the rules of saving nature.